Connolly.
Mhargaidh, I welcome the opportunity to take part in the debate on the introduction of this bill to the Dáil, the Energy Windfall Gains in the Energy Sector, Cap on Market Revenues Bill 23. And it's important to place it in context as usual, and where it's been referred to many times today with using different figures, but all amounting to the same message. As of November 22, it was estimated that roughly 40% of the households in Ireland were experiencing energy poverty. That was up from 29% in June 22 in a matter of months. Now just let that figure sink in. 40% of the households in Ireland were experiencing energy poverty in one of the richest countries in the world. So that sort of makes any sort of rational, average, intelligent person begin to think, what is wrong here with our policies? What is it we need to do? Rather than fighting, or rather than, I hear lots of ministers saying, I gave that much money and I gave this much money. Actually, it's taxpayers' money. And what is it we need to do with those startling figures? I have a friend who works with the Defence and DePaul on a voluntary basis, as they all do. The stories are absolutely shocking. And there's something seriously wrong with our policies and our inequity. We hear it every year from Social Justice Ireland, who go to terrible trouble, enormous trouble, to highlight the good and the bad of each budget and begging us and appealing to us to do something different. So here we are today bringing in a bill which I welcome. You couldn't but welcome a bill which seeks to cap the revenue coming in above a certain point, and it's been set out in the bill. The bill itself was published on the 31st of August, 36 pages, 4 parts and 33 sections. In the scheme of the bills that we get before us, it's a relatively compact bill. In trying to understand it, as I made the point yesterday, it's extremely difficult. And I find it ironic that we have NALA, the National Adult Literacy Organisation, appealing for plain English language, and yet in the Dáil we persist. And I consider myself of average intelligence. I take the trouble to read documents as best I can, not always, and it's really difficult. So here let me welcome on a general level the theme of the bill, which seeks to cap revenue above a certain thing as set out, one at two different prices and then one a variable rate, depending on the sources. And I'll come back how that's going to be distributed. But the mechanisms of that are very difficult to understand. And just before I even go into some more of it, the delay in bringing in this bill is simply unacceptable. The directive is from last October. We're almost a year later and we're bringing in a bill. Now, that begs, I understand we can't have retrospective legislation, but this legislation is retrospective, isn't it? It's going back to a certain period of time, but not going back to when the peak profits were made. Perhaps you might explain that to us, how we can be retrospective to a certain extent, but not back to the peak profits were made. Now, so one thing is the delay in our obligation to implement the regulation. And of course, only one aspect of it was to cap the revenue, to give that revenue out then to those who are suffering. And again, I'm going to come to that if I can, if I have time, the vagueness of that, how that's going to be paid out, and the enormous power left to the minister under Section 28 and other sections to devise schemes outside of the Oireachtas and without our supervision. But the other stated aim of the EU regulation was to reduce electricity demand. And nowhere do I see that reflected in the legislation. I don't know where it's going to be reflected, but again, data centres have been mentioned many times. And a not sterile debate that we need data centres and putting our hands up for data centres, rather than an analysis of what functions they're actually performing, the energy they're consuming, and at what cost to our energy security. None of that is reflected here in the debate today. The cap, of course, is only on non-gas generators and producers, intermediaries and retail people that are listed. As I said, it confers great powers on the minister, and I'm extremely worried about that. There's a lot of may. There's no shall and may, and it's not clear to me how it's going to be distributed or in what manner. The agency collecting it will be EirGrid, and the CRU will manage the records and the accounts. I understand at the moment the CRU externalise or outsource over 23% of their work in relation to reports. What provisions are you making to insource expertise so that the CRU will be up to the job of managing this very complex, I would say, contorted mechanism for bringing back some of the obscene profits that have been made on the backs of suffering people? And you know, when I read all of this stuff, and yesterday was the same in relation to whatever the subject was yesterday, and the EU, and we're willing partners with the EU, no way can we distort the market. That's neoliberalism. We cannot distort the market, but we can distort people's lives over and over. We can drive them to the brink. We can bring prices up so that 88,000 people went without energy in this very rich country, but we can't distort the market. But when the market fails, as it repeatedly does in relation to housing, in relation to what's happened with our energy, then we will come up with contorted solutions to ensure their profitability and take back a little bit. And even then, we won't put shall into the legislation. We put may and maybe as opposed to shall. For those people who have suffered the most, we will give back to them. We don't do that. We don't explain why it's not retrospective, but it is retrospective to suit the government. We don't look at the recommendations of the pre-legislative scrutiny that was completed last May. And there were 10 recommendations. And I want to thank, as usual, the library and the digest that they've produced to help us. And the Committee on Pre-Legislative Scrutiny on the General Scheme, published in May, had 10 recommendations. And according to the digest produced by the library, 3 are clearly reflected in the bill, 5 are possibly reflected, or it is unclear whether they are reflected, and 2 are not reflected at all. So we go to the trouble of pre-legislative scrutiny, they go to the trouble of 10 recommendations, and the Minister and the Department doesn't even zone in to tell us a response to that. The 2 recommendations not reflected in the legislation, one which we're all asking for on this side of the House, that the legislation should be more prescriptive as to the targets of the revenues raised so that they're directed to the most vulnerable. And again, I more than anyone understand that legislation can't be too prescriptive, but the amount of power left to the Minister without any oversight is simply unacceptable. The second one that's been omitted, that consideration be given to extending the cap on market revenues retrospectively to include the months when the energy crisis was at its peak. That's a recommendation from the Pre-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in their report, and it's been ignored. Ireland is one of a number of countries, is one of 8 countries to apply the minimum timeline, whereas all the other countries have extended that. And indeed, the EU in the regulation has allowed us great discretion as to how we implement that in terms of legislation on the ground, and we have taken the most minimalist approach. 7 EU members, Austria, Belgium, and so on, I won't have all extended. 7 of them have extended the application period in some way, either retrospectively or made it longer. In relation to the review carried out by the EU or the Commission or whatever competent authority was doing it for them, they carried out a review even before we had our legislation brought in. So I don't know how we participated in that review. Perhaps you might enlighten us. Unfortunately, I'm going to be gone, but I will check the record of your speech to see if you have enlightened me as to how we participated in that review before our legislation was passed, or if we learned from it. There's a failure to distinguish between large providers and community-owned renewable energy generators. This again was raised in the pre-legislative scrutiny. And you know, I'm really doing my best to find out how many community-led energy projects we have in this country. I'm looking even at something as basic as Galway, which I was delighted at. It's tangential but related. We declared, and fair play to the City Council, a decarbonised zone back in 2019. We've still done nothing, Minister, about that decarbonised zone up in Westside. Theoretically brilliant. A biodiversity emergency, a climate emergency, and 2023 we're still waiting on the because they're waiting on the Department of Housing for something or other. I don't know. I can't remember. I've had so many responses to questions. But that's just an example of the failure to take it seriously. I personally would like to see community-based, and I'll come back to this maybe at the very end. We need transformative action here. We need to look at taking control of as the previous speaker has said, we need to be independent in the provision of our energy. And it has to be done on a non-profit basis. And it seems to me we're gone headlong along the road again of the very model that has caused the existential threat that we're facing with climate change. And of course, the vulnerable always suffer the most. And I would love to see yourself, Minister, and the Green Party make a difference, and you'll have my full support in relation to community models and community-owned energy production. We can do that. It's significant that yesterday we were talking about local government and Limerick, and we looked at really the decimation of local authorities and the removal of power from them. And in that context, I was reading many reports that were given by the Association of representing the councillors and various academics, and they've gone around the world and pointed out, and the word is difficult for me to pronounce, remunicipalisation. There is a whole process where they're taking back the utility companies to own them all over the world in the paragon examples of capitalism in Germany, in Canada, and various other countries. They're taking back because they're more effective, run publicly, albeit with the expertise from outside and albeit with paying them decent wages and salaries. I've said that the burden on the CRU, the additional burden, has to be faced, and I would like clarification on that. I'll finish up by saying the lack of vision is really worrying for me as a TD. I don't want to be here arguing week after week or finding holes in the government's policies, but I have no choice given what we're facing. And the word transformative change, the two words have been thrown out repeatedly so often that they've become meaningless. And all the time, under that umbrella of transformative change, we're pursuing the very same policies that have led, as I've said already, to disaster. And it's the same thing. I have my serious concerns about the MARA agency that has been set up in relation to the further development of the oceans. And I feel we're following the same exploitive model that has got us into trouble. International examples of publicly owned utilities, the EDF in France, a publicly owned utility that competes on the market, as I understand it, and subject to correction. Statkraft Norway is the largest renewables generator in Europe and is owned by the Norwegian state. Remember, they did the same thing with oil, and remember, they put money aside in a sovereign fund while we did the complete opposite and almost bowed down to the profit-making companies, bowed down without taking anything back. I'm trying to get my head around why gas determines the price of the other energy providers. As the most expensive, it determines and allows the other companies to make obscene profits. And I'll finish by saying, Deputy Bruton spoke about that we're not given recognition to the amount of money given out by the government. I pay tribute to you for the money that you've paid out, the billions in packages. My difficulty is they're all once off, notwithstanding their billions. They're once off without any transformative action. And Deputy Bruton referred to the 1.6 billion that was given to help people pay their bills. And really, the reason that that had to be so big was because the government was absolutely tardy in bringing in legislation that would take even a little bit of the profit back from the energy companies that were making obscene profits. So the taxpayer had to come up with the 1.6 billion and the other billions that have been paid out. And so while I welcome that, I deplore the slow action of the government in dealing with the threat. And certainly the war in Ukraine has contributed to this, but for a very long time, TDs on this side of the House were pointing out that energy prices were rising and rising to no avail. Thank you.